The balloons burst under the crystal chandelier, and something no one expected happened. The trembling little girl in the corner suddenly fell silent. The man blowing those bubbles was only a janitor in a faded uniform, yet he held the key that could alter the fate of an entire powerful family. In the marble hall, where high heels clicked in sharp rhythm and phones buzzed endlessly, 6-year-old Sophie Hale, with messy blonde hair, curled up like an abandoned fledgling. Managers and staff exchanged helpless glances. Some whispered urgently into their phones. Others simply kept their distance, fearful of the child's unpredictable breakdowns. The security guard barked at them to stay back, but Daniel Reed quietly sat down, set his mop bucket aside, lifted a plastic straw to his lips, and patiently blew another bubble. They floated low, then drifted, shimmering in blue, purple, and pink, like fragments of a rainbow breaking through the frozen air. Miraculously, Sophie's wild eyes softened, her breath slowed, and her tiny hands stopped pressing against her ears. A bubble brushed her shoulder. She flinched, then looked up, as if for the first time in months she had found something safe enough to believe in. From the mezzanine, behind a glass railing, Victoria Hale froze. The CEO known for her cold, steel-edged authority, the woman who could silence an international boardroom with one look, now clutched the glass table, staring at a sight she could hardly believe. Her daughter, after a parade of failed doctors and specialists, soothed by an unknown man with rubber gloves still damp with soap. When the last bubble dissolved into the air, Victoria's heels struck the stone floor in sharp beats. She motioned for security to step aside and strode toward Daniel. "What's your name?" Her voice was cutting. "Daniel Reed," he replied, eyes still on the child. "What did you just do to my daughter?" "Nothing, just bubbles." The simplicity of the answer sounded almost like defiance. Victoria swallowed hard, watching her daughter follow the fragile rainbow fragments. For the first time in nearly a year, Sophie wasn't screaming, wasn't convulsing, just sitting still. "Come with me," Victoria ordered. Her tone was firm, yet her hand trembled as she adjusted the ring on her finger. Daniel rose, his work boots leaving damp prints across the gleaming floor, and followed her into the elevator. When the steel doors closed, the crowd still murmured, as if they had witnessed the impossible. On the 40th floor, the office was as cold as a museum. Victoria sat behind her desk, eyes sharp. "You just calmed my daughter. I want you to continue." Daniel shook his head. "I'm just a janitor. I can't help you." "Don't be modest. Clearly you know how." "No, I'm not a doctor, not a specialist. I'm not who you're looking for." Her breath caught. She wasn't used to refusal. "Then, why could you do what every expert failed to do?" Daniel hesitated, then rose. His voice was low, steady. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hale. I can't." He paused at the door, turned slightly, and murmured, "You want to save her? Try sitting with her, instead of commanding from above." Then he stepped out, leaving behind the gleaming, lifeless room. Victoria remained frozen, chest pounding as though thousands of bubbles had just burst inside her. That night, in a cramped apartment, Daniel's 8-year-old daughter Emily spread paper across the table, sketching floating green bubbles. When her father came home, she looked up. "Dad, did you blow bubbles for someone again today?" Daniel stopped, unable to answer right away. He only ruffled her hair gently and stared at the drawing, feeling a sharp tug in his chest. He had turned the woman down, but he knew deep inside that what happened wasn't chance. It was a part of him he had buried long ago, a love for children like Sophie. and a fear of facing the past he had never fully escaped. 2 days later, while Daniel was changing the mop water in the basement, the powerful woman appeared, not in her usual expensive business attire, but in a simple white shirt, holding a folder. Victoria Hale was not used to humbling herself before anyone, but this time her voice was unusually subdued. "Mr. Reed, I need to talk." Daniel did not look up, his hands still wringing out the rag. "I already told you. I can't help." His tone was calm. Victoria stepped closer, her eyes carrying something between exhaustion and hope. "I've tried everything. Doctors, specialists, special schools." She remained silent, but that day she smiled. "You have no idea how important that is." Daniel frowned slightly, his expression flickering with unease. He remembered that moment well, the faint smile of Sophie etched deep in his mind. But he shook his head, forcing his voice to stay firm. "I don't work for you, and I don't believe you'll change anything if you still treat her like a project that needs to be fixed." Victoria hesitated, then for the first time admitted, "Perhaps you're right. I'm used to managing everything like a company. But this is not a contract. This is my daughter." The sincerity in her words left Daniel silent for a long while. Finally, he sighed. "If I agree, there will be conditions. I don't work for you. I work with Sophie. No cameras, no therapists hovering, and most importantly, you must be there. Don't hand her over to me and disappear into your office." Victoria nodded, her eyes steady. "I promise." That afternoon, Daniel brought his daughter Emily to the Hale penthouse. The vast apartment resembled a museum. White walls, gleaming glass, expensive furniture, yet devoid of warmth. Emily, 8 years old, clutched her bag of crayons and whispered to her father, "This place doesn't feel like home." Daniel only patted her head and said, "Just draw like you always do." Sophie sat in the corner, eyes fixed on the city window, unresponsive to their entrance. Daniel sat on the floor, at a distance, quietly opening his sketchbook, while Emily spread out paper and began drawing a flower in green. Slowly, the heavy atmosphere shifted when Sophie tilted her head, her gaze lingering on the colorful page. She cautiously moved closer, saying nothing, just sitting beside Emily. The two girls drew side by side in silence, but it was a different silence, no longer heavy but soft, like a gentle melody. Victoria stood in the doorway, frozen. For months, her daughter had never approached anyone on her own like this. At that moment, an aged voice thundered, "What is happening here?" Charles Whitmore, Victoria's father and Sophie's grandfather, entered with commanding presence. He had built the Hale empire alongside the family, his sharp eyes sweeping over Daniel before settling on Sophie. "A janitor in the Hale household? What kind of joke is this, Victoria?" His tone was cutting, as though Daniel's presence was a stain. Victoria stood tall, facing her father, calm yet firm. "I'm not joking. You see, Sophie is sitting with a friend, for the first time in a very long time." Charles faltered for a brief second, his gaze wavering, but quickly returned to icy coldness. "Don't let this family's image be tied to someone unworthy. It will destroy everything." Daniel said nothing. He simply watched the two little girls bent over their drawings, as if deaf to the argument above them. When leaving the penthouse that evening, Daniel held Emily's hand, his heart torn. He had planned to refuse entirely, yet the sight of Sophie leaning down to color beside his daughter shook his resolve. He knew clearly, this child did not need to be fixed. She only needed someone patient enough to sit with her. And perhaps he too needed that. to rediscover the part of himself he had long lost. The meetings that followed were neither noisy nor filled with sudden miracles. They unfolded quietly, slowly, like drops of water sinking into dry soil. Daniel kept coming regularly, carrying his old box of crayons, a few sheets of blank paper, and Emily. He never walked straight to Sophie, never stretched out his hand to push her. He simply sat down on the floor, spread out the paper, and began drawing with his daughter. Emily, carefree as ever, filled the pages with radiant flowers and plump little cats, sometimes sliding an extra crayon right beside Sophie. At first, Sophie only watched. Her eyes traced Emily's every line, but her hands clutched her knees, her body taut as a bowstring. Daniel did nothing but continue drawing, tilting his head slightly at times so she could see. He was not waiting, not judging. His patience lay like a soft carpet, waiting for the child to step onto it when she was ready. One afternoon, as the last light spilled across the wooden floor, Sophie slowly stretched out her hand. Her finger brushed a green crayon, then quickly pulled back as if it burned. Daniel saw it, a pang striking his chest, but he made no move. He knew any urging could shatter the fragile moment, and just as he hoped, minutes later, the small hand reached again, this time holding on. A shaky green line appeared on the paper, short, trembling, but enough to change the room's air. Emily smiled brightly, then carried on drawing, saying nothing, as if it were perfectly ordinary. Victoria stood in the doorway, clutching her notebook. She was used to sterile medical reports, bulleted lists of symptoms. When she saw that crooked green mark on the page, she hardly knew how to classify it. Her eyes blurred, but Daniel shook his head gently, warning her not to break the spell. For the first time in many months, Sophie had left her trace in something shared. The next day, Victoria appeared again, not in an elegant suit, but in a plain white shirt. When Daniel laid out the paper, she lowered herself too, kneeling on the floor. Her movements were awkward, almost comical, a colored pencil slipping from her hand, a crooked circle becoming a lopsided sun. Emily burst into giggles. The sound of childlike laughter rang out, and strangely, it didn't frighten Sophie. Instead, she tilted her head and watched longer. Her lips quivered as though words might form, but silence held. For Daniel, that silence was not failure. It was beginning. A week later, Sophie had grown more comfortable. She could sit beside Emily for several minutes without retreating. Once, she even placed a yellow crayon in Emily's hand, a rare invitation. Daniel marked it silently in his mind. The child had begun to give. He knew it wasn't spontaneous. It was the fruit of safety, built patiently, piece by piece. That evening, after Sophie had gone to sleep, Victoria lingered with Daniel in the living room. The lamp cast a soft glow across her face, still, tense, but her eyes gentler. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Daniel replied, "I did nothing. I just let her see that I stayed." The simple words caught in Victoria's throat. She was used to paying for solutions, used to quick results. Now she had to accept that what her daughter needed couldn't be bought, only given through time and patience. On another afternoon, Charles visited again. He stood in the doorway, his aged eyes surveying. What he saw wasn't a miracle therapy, only two girls drawing together, a quiet man watching, and his daughter with sleeves smudged in color. He frowned, muttering, "Don't turn my granddaughter into an experiment." Daniel looked up, calm. "I'm not experimenting. I'm listening." Charles prepared to retort, but Sophie's gaze was fixed on the drawing, her hand resting near a streak of blue. He said nothing more, turned away, though his steps slowed unnaturally. That evening, leaving the building, Daniel held Emily's hand. She looked up and whispered, "Dad, today Sophie drew with me. Was she talking with colors?" Daniel stroked her head and murmured, "Yes. Not everyone speaks with words. Some speak with their eyes, some with their drawings. What matters is whether we choose to listen." Emily nodded, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. Daniel sighed. He knew that every line Sophie drew was not only saving her life, it was knocking on the locked door of his own memories. And sooner or later, he would have to open it. Late in the afternoon, just as Daniel and Emily were leaving the Hale building, a black limousine stopped at the entrance. The door opened, and Richard Hale, Victoria's ex-husband and Sophie's biological father, stepped out. He looked as polished as ever, a perfectly tailored suit, gleaming shoes, an arrogant smile. But behind the glamour, his cold eyes made Victoria falter when they met. News of his return spread like wildfire. Only days later, Victoria's lawyer placed a lawsuit on her desk. Richard was officially demanding custody of Sophie. In his statement, he argued that Victoria was incapable of caring for their daughter and was relying on an unqualified man. He didn't need to name him. Everyone knew he meant Daniel Reed. That evening, the penthouse was thick with tension. Richard sat in the living room as if he had never left, his tone calm but laced with knives. "Victoria, you've proven you can't do this. She needs a professional environment, real doctors, not the interference of a janitor." Victoria clenched her hands, nails digging into her skin. She wanted to fight back, but in Richard's presence, anger only made her weaker. Charles stepped out from the study, his gaze severe like a judge. He looked at Daniel, standing behind with Emily, and said coldly, "She's my granddaughter. This family cannot have its image tied to a cleaner. He will drag us all down." The words fell like heavy stones. Daniel stayed silent, made no defense, his eyes fixed only on Sophie. The little girl sat curled in the corner. The shouting of adults sent tremors through her body. Her hands clamped over her ears, her breath uneven. Emily, long used to this, slipped quietly onto the carpet, placed her small hand on Sophie's, and whispered, "It's okay." Sophie froze, her gaze shifting from the arguing faces to the drawing Emily had just made. Daniel lowered himself beside the two girls, pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket, and quickly drew a simple flower. He didn't speak, didn't explain, only placed the sketch on the floor between them. Sophie slowly reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched the green lines, then pulled the page toward her. No sound left her lips, but the act was enough for everyone to see. While the adults threw accusations, she had chosen her own safe place. Victoria's throat tightened at the sight. She wanted to shout at Richard that no specialist had ever achieved this, Sophie reaching out, choosing to connect. But Daniel remained silent, letting the evidence reveal itself. Richard paused for only a second before regaining his arrogance. "A random gesture proves nothing," he said, rising to put on his coat. "The court will decide, and I believe the outcome is already clear." Charles did not protest or defend her, only stood silent, though his aged eyes flickered briefly. When the door closed behind Richard, the room felt as if a storm had just passed. Victoria collapsed into a chair, her hand to her forehead. "You saw it," she said to Daniel, her voice shaking. "I'm about to lose her. Richard has money, power, and even my father. Daniel interrupted, his tone low but steady. Sophie just chose. Not with words, but with action. You saw it. Victoria lifted her head, tears spilling. Fear still clung to her, yet a spark of hope flickered. Daniel made no promises, offered no illusions. He simply laid his hand on Emily's shoulder and nodded toward Sophie, as if to remind her that the strongest proof was not in arguments, but in those small, undeniable gestures. That night, after bringing Emily home, Daniel wrote in his notebook, "Today, Sophie pulled the paper toward herself." That was her way of saying, "I'm here." He knew the legal battle ahead would be brutal, but within him a new faith had taken root, that a 6-year-old girl could do what no words from any adult ever could, show who truly stood by her side. The courtroom was cold in the morning light, the benches packed with people. Richard sat tall, his gaze confident as if the verdict were already his. His lawyer rose, voice sharp as steel. "Your Honor, Mrs. Victoria Hale entrusted her daughter to a janitor without credentials. The so-called therapy consisted of blowing bubbles, scribbling drawings, reckless and risky." Whispers rippled through the room, a few nods of agreement. Victoria tightened her hands on the table, then stood. Her voice shook, yet carried clearly. "Yes, I let Daniel stay with Sophie, and during that time she ate a soft meal after months of refusing. She drew alongside another person, and for the first time showed signs of connection. I tried every specialist, every therapy room, all in vain. He only sat down, without judgment, and my daughter began to change. If that is a mistake, I accept it." The judge nodded, then called the next witness. Daniel stepped to the stand. He placed his hand on the oath, his voice low but steady. "My name is Daniel Reed. I was a special education teacher for 11 years. 4 years ago, my wife died in a paragliding accident. I witnessed it, powerless. After that, I no longer had the courage to stand in a classroom. I became a janitor to raise my daughter and to hide from memory. But when I met Sophie, my instincts returned. I am not providing therapy, no miracle method. I only sit with her, listen to her silence, and wait." Richard's lawyer cut in. "You abandoned your career because of trauma. How can this court trust someone like you?" Daniel lifted his head, replying slowly, "I did not lose knowledge. I lost faith. Sophie showed me that faith can return. If you do not trust my words, look at the child herself." All eyes turned toward Sophie. She sat beside Emily, clutching her notebook. Emily gave a small nod, as if encouraging her. Sophie hesitated, then opened the book and held up a drawing. 3 figures holding hands under a blue sky. Murmurs filled the room again. The judge leaned forward, studying the paper, then asked gently, "What do you call this picture, child?" The room held its breath. Sophie gripped the edge of the sheet, her lips trembling. Everyone waited. Then, from the silence, a fragile yet resounding sound broke through. "Blue." The courtroom froze. Victoria covered her mouth, tears spilling. Daniel closed his eyes, hearing past and present converge in that single word. Richard stiffened, his hand tightening on the chair. From the back row, Charles Whitmore rose. He tapped his cane on the floor, voice deep. "I once thought this was weakness, but today my granddaughter showed me it is strength. I stand with my daughter." The silence turned into a wave of emotion. Richard's lawyer tried to recover, thrusting forward a file of expert reports. But the judge had heard enough. He read the updated medical notes. Sophie showing reduced avoidance behaviors, participating in drawing at school, beginning to use single words in safe settings. Closing the folder, his tone was decisive. This court rules that Sophie Hale shall remain with her mother. Mr. Daniel Reed is permitted to continue in the role of supportive companion under the supervision of the professional team. Mr. Richard Hale retains visitation rights, but not in a way that disrupts the care plan. The gavel struck, silencing every murmur. Victoria clutched Sophie tightly, whispering, "Thank you," through tears. Sophie buried her face in her mother's shoulder, still gripping the green page. Daniel stepped back, eyes red. Charles turned away, giving the smallest nod, a promise to stand on the right side. In the hallway outside, flashbulbs flared and questions rained down. Victoria reached for Daniel's hand, not as a CEO seeking an ally, but as a mother grasping for strength. "They will ask so much," she whispered. Daniel answered, "Let Sophie reply with her colors. The rest, we can endure." After the trial, Victoria did not hold a press conference. She sat for a long time on the courthouse steps, Sophie resting against her shoulder, Daniel standing a pace away, before quietly saying, "The next step had to be done right from the very beginning." Right did not mean glossy real estate or a nameplate in gold, but a place where her daughter could walk in without bracing herself. 3 days later, they found a spare room in the community library. White walls, a wide window, old wooden floors, but steady. Daniel brought a suitcase filled with crayons, soft balls, foldable mats, and picture cards. Victoria carried a thin folder, its cover labeled only "Sit down with your child." 2 independent specialists agreed to support, designing schedules, setting goals, keeping journals, reassessing periodically so everything stayed transparent, just as the court required. Charles arrived last, pausing at the doorway to ask something he never had before. "What do you need first? Money or quiet?" Daniel answered, "Quiet first, money later." Charles nodded, for once giving no further instruction. The name was settled in 10 minutes. The Reed Hale Room. Emily scribbled an extra line beneath. A room without walls. Without walls meant removing invisible barriers. No forcing eye contact, no grading progress, no compulsory participation. At the entrance, Victoria suggested posting 4 principles. No photographing children. Adults sit before speaking. 5 minutes of silence counts as an activity. Colors are language. Daniel added one more line. When the child does not speak, we ask with fewer words. The room was arranged simply. A drawing corner by the window, low bookshelves at child's height, beanbags, a quiet nest made of green curtains, soft headphones, and a noise reduction box placed in easy reach. Sophie lingered at the doorway, her finger tapping a steady rhythm, this time not in defense. She picked up a yellow crayon, set it beside a blue one, and whispered, "Son." Daniel held back a breath, only placing a card that read 3-minute break, a reminder that joy, too, needed pacing. Victoria herself drew up the logbook with 4 columns. What the child chose, how the child reacted, what the adult did, adjustment for next time. In the column, what the adult did, she wrote, sat down, waited, asked with color. Daniel looked at the handwriting and knew she had truly shifted from manager to companion. Charles remained silent the entire session. When his eyes fell on the sign, "No photographing children," he removed his glasses, read carefully, then exhaled, as if letting go of a piece of pride. He offered to pay the rent for 3 years, but refused to have his name on the wall. On opening day, there were no ribbons or speeches, only 3 strings, blue, yellow, red, tied to the doorknob. Emily handed the scissors over. Sophie looked at them for a long moment, then snipped cleanly. The sound was small, the applause even smaller. Sophie stepped in, walked a circle, and stopped at the drawing table where two crayons lay side by side. She turned back, looking at her mother, at Daniel, at her grandfather. "Family," she whispered, not like a word just learned, but like a decision. Victoria did not collapse, only did exactly what she had written. She sat down, her open hand resting on the mat, letting her daughter choose whether to reach for it. Daniel stepped half a pace back, remembering his role as supportive companion under supervision. Charles lowered himself as well, leaning his cane against the wall, sitting level with his granddaughter. On the wall, the first month's goal sheet was posted at child's height. Not say 5 more words, but choose one more safe place and try one new shade. Next to it, Emily hung a rainbow drawing with a small note. "Tomorrow add a little more yellow." News of the room spread not by press release, but through a single photograph taken from behind. 2 adults sitting cross-legged on the mat between 2 children drawing. No faces, only lowered backs and open hands. When asked why she created it this way, Victoria answered briefly, "Because my daughter speaks in colors. Our job is to keep the room quiet enough to hear." That evening, as Daniel locked the door, he thought quietly, today they had not built walls. They had built a home. 6 months had passed since the room without walls first opened. The whiteboard at the entrance was now covered with the scribbles of dozens of children. A few curved blue lines, a yellow sun, red fingerprints scattered like wildflowers. Adults who came here gradually grew used to leaving their shoes at the door, lowering their voices, and sitting down before doing anything. Each child had a corner of their own, something that belonged to them, even if it was just a beanbag molded to their shape or a single crayon waiting in its box. Sophie's changes were not loud, not sudden. She still had days of withdrawal, still tapped her fingers to hold off the chaos in her head. But now she could choose. Some days she chose the drawing corner with Emily. Others she chose the quiet nest. And sometimes she chose silent walks in the library garden. For the first time, she added a streak of yellow beside the blue in her drawing, whispering, "Hope." After that, a tiny red dot. Brave. Daniel could not hide his emotion, but he did not cheer like a victor. He only wrote in his notebook, "The child is opening her own palette." Victoria, too, was different. She no longer panicked each time her daughter went silent, no longer drowned herself in meetings while others took over. Every Thursday morning, she set aside a full hour in the drawing room with Sophie and Emily. Once, she rolled up her sleeves, ending up with red stains across her office dress. "I used to think a mess was failure," she laughed. "Now I call it evidence." Her company staff were surprised to see their CEO occasionally vanish from her packed schedule to sit on the floor with the kids. Yet that very image made shareholders view her differently, a leader with the strength to humble herself and listen. Charles no longer stayed on the sidelines either. Every Friday afternoon, he came to tell stories. At first, he simply read a few pages in a flat voice. Gradually, he learned to sit still when the children did not respond, to ask shorter questions. One day, he told a story without an ending, leaving space for Sophie to complete it with color. When she laid down a stroke of blue, he nodded as if signing an important contract. "She doesn't need me to explain," he admitted. "She needs me to sit still so she can add a word of her own." In those days, Daniel slowly mended his own fractures. He still dreamed of the moment his wife fell from the sky, still woke in the night with helplessness pressing on his chest. But now he had a place where memory no longer chained him. Each time Sophie added a color, each time Emily pulled her friend's hand and they laughed together, he felt his purpose clearly. Not to scrub away the world's stains, but to preserve the marks children left behind. On the day Sophie entered first grade, autumn gold stretched across the suburban streets. She wore a fresh uniform, hair tied neatly, walking slowly, yet not, clinging to her mother's shoulder as before. At the school gate, she held a drawing of a delicate rainbow and whispered, "Gift." Victoria squeezed her daughter's hand and looked at Daniel. Both stood silent. Once, they had only hoped Sophie might sit still in class. Now she walked in by choice, carrying her own offering. That afternoon, in the community garden behind the library, they gathered as usual. Emily ran in circles. Sophie sat at the wooden table adding red to the rainbow. Victoria opened her journal and wrote, "Today my daughter chose to step into the world with a picture in her hands." Daniel sat beside her, his gaze gentle. He no longer thought of himself as a substitute. He was simply part of this home. Charles sat on the stone bench, watching 3 generations before him, quietly wiping his eyes. "Yes," he murmured. "At last we are a family." As the sun set, Sophie lifted her head, smiling one of her rare smiles, and whispered, "Tomorrow, we draw a new sky." No one answered. They simply sat together, letting the small promise ring out like a closing theme to a long journey, from fear to colors to a shared home. This story reminds us that healing does not always begin with grand methods, but with the smallest acts. Someone willing to sit down, a color given a name, a home that listens. The room without walls was not only for Sophie, but for all of us. A reminder that sometimes the most precious gift we can offer is our true presence. If this story touched you, share it to spread the belief that love and patience can change a life. Remember, you don't need to be an expert to bring hope. Sometimes it only takes sitting down, opening a hand, and saying, "I am here with you." And perhaps, in that very moment, you may find the best part of yourself again.